Public Nemesis Media.
It's the 6th century and the Balkans look much different from what it was before. The southeastern part of Europe was taken over by an Indo-European group of people from the north called the Slavs. The numerous Slavic tribes have conquered and settled in the Balkans, taking most of the peninsula's territory, going as far as taking most of the Peloponnese Peninsula. The result of these settlements are regions which originate from the ancient times becoming Slavic. One of those regions was Macedonia. You may remember from part 1 that, aside from the strongly fortified city of Thessaloniki, the entire territory of Macedonia was populated by Slavs following the migrations. This video will focus on those Slavic tribes in Macedonia who are the ancestors of modern Macedonians. Now, I'll use the term Macedonian Slavs a lot in this video, and I believe I should explain that term before we go any further. Macedonian Slavs does not mean ethnic Macedonians, it simply means Slavs that live in Macedonia. The Macedonian national identity, as well as other nationalities, started to form in the 19th century, hence why Macedonian since the 19th century and Macedonian before the 19th century are two different things. Yes, you can find references to Macedonians from the 7th, 13th and 17th century that refer to people who lived in the region of Macedonia. Trying to find the Macedonian national identity that far in the past would be ridiculous. With all of that being said, there is still a strong ground to stand on when making a differentiation between Macedonian Slavs and all other Slavs. You see, there's this thing which the Byzantines called Slovenia. It was basically a Slavic proto-state with autonomy, or in other words, a territory with Slavs that was independent from Roman rule. The term Slovenia was mostly used for the proto-state of Macedonian Slavs, which was sometimes referred to as Macedonian Slovenia by the Byzantines. There were 7 Slavic tribes that made the Macedonian Slovenia: Berziti, Vajuniti, Dragoviti, Rinhini, Sagudati, Smoljani, and Strumljani. The existence of these tribes was documented by the Romans, who also wrote on the invasions and attacks from those Slavs. Saint Demetrius of Thessaloniki created an entire collection of homilies today known as the Miracles of Saint Demetrius, in which he mentioned a Macedono-Slavic king named Hatson, who led a 2-year-long siege from 614 to 616 of Macedonian Slavs against the city of Thessaloniki. Although they didn't manage to conquer the city, they definitely caused a lot of trouble to the Byzantines, who tried but failed to subject the Slavs in Macedonia. Then, around 675, another king of Macedonian Slavs called Prebond started another 2-year-long siege of Thessaloniki, though he would be captured and executed by the Byzantines. Another person worth mentioning was King Akamir, yet another Macedonian Slav who rebelled against Byzantium with his fellow Slavs. The Romans had their own attacks on the Slavs, yet their attacks would become successful only since the mid-8th century. First Constantine V, then Michael III in the 9th century, gathered enough strength to conquer some Slovenias, such as the one in the Peloponnesus. Then they would force the Slavs out and move the Greek speakers in those areas. When it comes to the Macedonian Slovenia, that proto-state finally fell under Roman rule in 785 thanks to Constantine VI. The fall of Macedonian Slovenia has turned the Slavs there into a people that were forced to pay taxes to the Byzantine Empire, though it's worth mentioning that those Slavs still had some self-governing, which was always a concern for the Romans. There was also the Byzantine policy of moving Greek speakers to Macedonia, mostly in the southern parts of that region. This situation remained until the mid-9th century, when Macedonia started to get conquered by another empire, Bulgaria. The Bulgarian Empire was a local superpower whose strength matched the strength of the Eastern Roman Empire. Matter of fact, it was so powerful that the Romans had to recognize it as a sovereign empire in 681. It was founded by a Turkic tribe called Bulgars, who crossed the Danube River and brought the Slavs in Moesia under a unified rule. The Bulgar-Byzantine battles and the Bulgar conquest of Macedonia was pretty bloody. For example, Khan Omurtag, as it was written on the Chtelar inscription, has fought not only Greeks but also Slavs that lived outside of Bulgaria. Then we have his successor, Khan Presian, the first ruler of Bulgaria that actually conquered some Macedonian land, who fought against the Smoleni and then subjected them. George Hamartolos wrote about the deal between Byzantium and Bulgaria under Presian, where the Slavic rebellion around Constantinople would be crushed by the Bulgar attack from behind. As George Hamartolos wrote, the Slavic rebellion turned into rivers of blood thanks to Presian's army. All of this points out that the Bulgars were not exactly the friendliest to the Slavs, so when they conquered some parts of Macedonia inhabited by Slavs, it wasn't the most pleasant rule. John Caminiatis, a Roman from Thessaloniki, wrote that the Slavs from Macedonian Slovenia, except those who remained under Byzantine rule, now had to pay taxes to the Bulgarian state. However, the Bulgarian rule of Macedonian Slavs was not entirely negative. The cooperation between Macedonian Slavs and Bulgarian Slavs has left a huge mark not just on modern Macedonians and Bulgarians, but on the Slavic world in general. The central figure in that cooperation was Presian's son and successor, Boris I. What separated him and all the previous rulers of Bulgaria was Christianity. Boris was a devout Christian and wanted to convert the population of his empire to Christianity. Thanks to his policy and successful military campaigns, Boris I managed to create a separate Bulgarian church with its own liturgy in the Slavic language. What's interesting is that the Slavic language was based on the dialects spoken by Macedonian Slavs. Now, how did that happen? It started with two brothers from Thessaloniki, Saint Cyril and Methodius. Their goal was to spread Christianity among the Slavs and create a writing script in hopes that the Slavs would become literate and conduct liturgy in Slavic. Those Macedonian Slavs went to Moravia, but they would be banished once the Pope got jurisdictional control over that state and voiced himself against the brothers. After they were kicked out, Saint Cyril and Methodius relocated in Bulgaria, where they were welcomed with open arms by Boris I. I must clarify that their campaign was far from unsuccessful. The saints created the Glagolitic script, the very first Slavic writing system. They also brought a lot of monks with them to Moravia and then Bulgaria, who continued their work even after both of them passed away. The most notable of these monks were Saint Clement, a Macedonian Slav, and Saint Naum, a Bulgarian Slav. With their help, Boris I established two literary schools, one in Ohrid, headed by Saint Clement, and the other in Preslav, headed by Saint Naum, where a script based on the Glagolitic one, called Cyrillic, was created since the Glagolitic writing system was a bit difficult to write. The two schools spread Christianity among the Slavs in the then Bulgarian Empire, as well as the language of Saint Cyril and Methodius, which would be the base for Old Church Slavonic, the language of the Bulgarian Church, Macedonian Slavs, and Bulgarian Slavs. With the Christianization and the establishment of a church and standard language with a Slavic character, the Macedonian Slavs have freed themselves from Hellenic influence, while the Bulgarian Slavs would get a base for the slow but sweet victory of Slavdom against the Turkic Bulgar rule. The Bulgars rebelled and tried to undo the Christianization and Slavization of Bulgaria, but Tsar Boris I defeated them. Yes, Boris I was a Tsar instead of a Khan due to his own policies. Bulgaria's control of Macedonia was quite short. Sure, Boris' successor Simeon had great campaigns against Byzantium, and he was the one to take control over the entire territory of Macedonia. However, ruling such a large empire proved to be quite difficult for Tsar Peter, Simeon's son and Boris' grandson. He wasn't a bad ruler, it's just that so much was stacked against Bulgaria. The biggest threat by far was an alliance the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus II made with Sviatoslav Igorevich, the Prince of Kievan Rus. For those unfamiliar with the Kievan Rus, it was an early state of Eastern Slavs located in modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. In a nutshell, the deal was that the Kievan Rus attacks the Bulgarian Empire from behind, while the Byzantine Empire attacks from the opposite side. The alliance turned out to be a fantastic idea, as the Rus people were a huge blow to Bulgaria. Matter of fact, Nicephorus gained a new problem cause Prince Sviatoslav decided to stay in the conquered Bulgarian land, so then the Byzantines would have to force them back. Regardless, the end result was a victory for the Byzantines. The Bulgarian capital Preslav was captured and renamed to Yiannopolis. The Bulgarian Patriarchate was reduced to an archbishopric subject of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Peter I had a stroke and died shortly after, and his two sons, Boris II and Roman, were taken hostages and imprisoned in Constantinople. Also, the unmarried Roman was turned into a eunuch. By 970, Bulgaria proper fell, and it seemed that the Byzantines wouldn't have any more problems. Unfortunately for them, their problems were far from over. One 11th century Eastern Roman historian by the name John Skilitzis wrote about an uprising in the Bulgarian state that caused unrest. Although Bulgaria proper was no more, there was still the territory on the west which it took since the time of Khan Presian's rule. This big chunk of land, most of which was Macedonia, has separated itself from the rest of Bulgaria in 969 through the uprising. Two pioneers of modern Bulgarian historiography, Marin Drinov and Konstantin Irecek, wrote about this event and how the Bulgarian Empire separated into two states. Drinov wrote that after the uprising, Macedonia separated from Peter's empire and formed into a separate country under the control of Samuel. Irecek went deeper and wrote that the uprising in Macedonia was a result of the weakness of the Bulgarian state, which consisted of hereditary principalities formed on the basis of the old Slavic partition by kinship. Both of these historians referred to the new state as Western Bulgarian Empire, which for some time existed alongside the Bulgarian Empire of Tsar Peter. It's not an incorrect term per se, because it was territory of the Bulgarian Empire and some Bulgarian traditions remained there, such as the Bulgarian crown. On the other hand, you can also find many writings referring to the new state as the Macedonian Empire, which also is not incorrect. That doesn't mean that the empire existed under that name, it's just that its core was the region of Macedonia. Aside from that, it was an empire of Macedonian Slavs, its capital was Prespa, then Ohrid, and although there was some continuity with the Bulgarian Empire, by its inner composition and foreign policy, it was an empire different from Bulgaria. Historians who extensively studied the new empire, like Georgios Rogoski and Srđan Pirivatrić, pointed out that the state in Macedonia was indeed a new state, which was noticeably different from the empire of Simeon and Peter. The Macedonian Slavs did not help the Bulgarian Slavs when they were attacked by Byzantium and Kievan Rus, and even later their interest for liberating Bulgaria was very small. They instead expanded their state to the south and, in typical Macedonian Slavic fashion, tried to conquer the city of Thessaloniki. As I already mentioned, the medieval Macedonian state was founded in 969 through an uprising against Bulgaria. The leaders of the uprising were from the Berziti tribe, and they were Comes Nicholas, the progenitor of the Kometopuli dynasty, and his four sons, David, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel. In the beginning, the empire was divided in four areas, one for each Nicholas's son. However, three of those four sons didn't manage to live for long. David was killed by Vlachs in his battle against the Byzantines. Moses was also killed fighting the Byzantines, while Aaron plotted to assassinate Samuel so he could be the only remaining ruler, but Samuel found out about the plot and he killed Aaron instead. By 976, Samuel was the only remaining and sole ruler of the Bulgarian/Macedonian Empire, which can also be, and has been, referred to as Samuel's Empire. Samuel expanded his land in every direction, mostly to the south, landing one victory after another. The Byzantines tried to stop their losses by sending Peter's sons, Boris II and Roman, to Samuel, and maybe cause confusion over who gets to be the ruler. Boris II was mistakenly murdered by a border guard who mistaken him for a Roman due to his Byzantine clothes, while Roman managed to find Samuel and explain to him that he was a member of the Bulgarian dynasty. Samuel recognized Roman as the legitimate Tsar. However, in practice, Samuel remained as the person who was in charge of the empire. Since that didn't work, the Byzantines tried to make an alliance to the north with the Croats and the Serbs, sort of like the alliance with the Kievan Rus. That didn't work since Samuel heard about their plan and decided to be a few steps ahead and conquer the lands to the north. He conquered a lot of lands which today belong to Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Croatia. Samuel also captured the ruler of Duklja, John Vladimir, though he would return him back to the conquered land of Duklja and made him his vassal after John Vladimir married Samuel's daughter Theodora Kosara. It wasn't just those northern lands. Samuel also conquered the lands of modern-day Albania, northern part of Bulgaria, and a lot of Greek lands, all the way to the Peloponnese Peninsula. This huge empire was the peak of power which the Macedonian Slavs showed to the world. To top it all off, Tsar Roman, who was recaptured by the Byzantines in 991, passed away in prison in 997. Since he didn't have male children, the dynasty he belonged to ended with his death, hence why Samuel asked the Pope for his blessing so that he could take the Bulgarian crown and become a recognized Tsar. In 997, Samuel officially became a Tsar and was internationally recognized as such. Now, to explain why he took the Bulgarian crown specifically, I'll quote Byzantium's Balkan Frontier by Paul Stephenson, a Cambridge University publication created by a medieval history professor. We cannot underestimate the significance of Samuel's coronation as Tsar of the Bulgarians. The exact meaning of the title and his right to bear it have been questioned by Balkan scholars. However, much debate has centered rather unfortunately on Samuel's ethnicity, and thus whether his empire was Macedonian or Bulgarian. The true significance of the title must surely be that his exact ethnicity, his place of birth, and his chosen residence in today's Republic of Macedonia were less important than the existence of a precedent. Simeon, his son Peter, and his grandson Boris had all been recognized by the Byzantine emperor to have a right to use the imperial style, and in 927 and circa 968 had been offered Byzantine imperial brides. Through the 10th century, this title had become ingrained in the public consciousness of both Slavs and Byzantines as the title held by the most powerful ruler among the peoples in the northern Balkans. It is only to be expected that Samuel would seek that title to give legitimacy to his broad geographical powers. It is also no surprise that he sought to use the eunuch Romanus, Peter's youngest son, to bolster his claim, as a eunuch Romanus was not entitled to hold the imperial office himself. The practice of claiming the title Emperor of the Bulgarians, therefore, had no ethnic significance. Unfortunately, this golden era in the freedom of Macedonian Slavs in general did not last for long. Around the year of 1000, the Eastern Roman Empire started striking back, and it conquered a lot of lands from Samuel's empire, shrinking the state by a half. Most of that Byzantine comeback was thanks to one of the greatest emperors of Byzantium, Basil II. In a series of battles, Basil II managed to slowly but steadily turn the Byzantine Empire into a large and dominant state in the Balkans, mostly at the expense of Macedonian Slavs. The decisive blow came in 1014 when the Battle of Clydon took place. In this battle, Basil's army killed around 30,000 Samuel's soldiers and captured around 15,000 more soldiers. Basil then ordered that the 15,000 soldiers be divided in groups of 100, then blind 99 of them, while only one of them would be left with one eye so that he could lead the 99 towards the town of Strumica. According to a legend which formed soon after these events, Tsar Samuel saw his numerous blinded soldiers and was so shocked he got a heart attack. He would pass away a couple of months later due to that heart attack in 1014. Following Samuel's death, The empire was taken over in charge by his son Gavril Radomir, but his rule didn't even last for a full year since he was murdered by John Vladislav, his cousin and the son of Aaron. As you can already guess, John Vladislav killed Gavril Radomir so he could take the throne for himself. Like father, like son. Since he was supported by the Byzantines, the relations were calm and friendly, but it was also of a short lifespan. In 1016, Basil II would continue with his attacks, capturing one town after another. In February of 1018, John Vladislav was killed in a Roman siege of Drač, modern-day Durrës. After that, Emperor Basil II marched into Ohrid, which was pretty much the last nail in the coffin for Samuel's empire. The Byzantines have eliminated Samuel's empire in 1018, but to be fair, they weren't too harsh towards the Macedonian Slavs. The powerful men there were given Byzantine wives, and instead of abolishing the Slavic Bulgarian Orthodox Church, they just, once again, reduced the rank from a patriarchate to an archbishopric. That was how the Archbishopric of Ohrid was formed. These measures were taken in order to cement Byzantine dominion in the region, though the measures weren't so extreme in hopes that it would stop rebellions against Byzantium. Spoilers, it didn't. Another big decision by the Byzantines was creating the Theme of Bulgaria, which incorporated many Macedonian Slavs. The creation of this theme has tremendously helped the Bulgarian name to stay in that area of the Balkan Peninsula, and the population, both Slavs and non-Slavs, were called Bulgarians. I must clarify that what I said about the term Macedonians in the beginning of this video also applies to the term Bulgarians. That was a regional term back then, and trying to find Bulgarian nationality in Macedonia that early in the past would be ridiculous. Let me show you why. Theophylact, one of the archbishops of Ohrid, was a Roman born in Epirus, but he referred to himself as a Bulgarian alongside other inhabitants of the theme. Meanwhile, Basil II, who was of Armenian origin, was from a dynasty known as Macedonians, who got that name from the theme of Macedonia they lived in, and that theme was ironically located in Thrace. Furthermore, John Kiriotis Geometris, a Byzantine soldier and poet, referred to Samuel's army as Moesians, while he referred to his fellow Romans as Avzonians. Meanwhile, the epitaph on the tomb of Basil II referred to Samuel's soldiers as Scythians, while much later, in the late 12th century, Basil II became known as the Bulgar Slayer. Also, I found a weird source that Ivan Alexander, a 14th century Tsar of Bulgaria, was referred as a Macedonian. I believe that now you see why looking for a national identity of Macedonian Slavs during the medieval era is pointless and wrong. Anyways, despite the Byzantine attempts to somewhat please the Macedonian Slavs by not completely subjecting them, there were unrests and rebellions every once in a while. The most notable ones were the 1040 uprising led by Tsar Samuel's grandson Petar Delian, and the 1070 uprising led by an aristocrat from Skopje named Georgi Wojtech. Sadly, all uprisings were crushed. Once Samuel's empire disappeared, the Macedonian Slavs went through an almost 1,000-year-long period of being occupied, fighting for freedom, and being tossed around from one empire to another. Basil II conquered the region of Macedonia, and it remained Byzantine until the late 12th century, when the Second Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Kaloyan started taking Macedonia back. Then the Byzantines retook Macedonia in the mid-13th century and kept it until the Serbian Empire under Tsar Dušan conquered Macedonia around 1345. The Serbian rule of Macedonia didn't last long, as it was taken away by a new player in the Balkans and then global superpower, the Ottoman Empire. Around 1392, the Ottoman Turks conquered Macedonia and have remained there until the early 20th century. That was a difficult period, not just for the Macedonian Slavs, but for the Christian Balkan people in general. The population left towns and moved to live in villages, boys were taken to be turned into janissaries, and Turkish domination was established on the peninsula. Things got even worse when the Ohrid Archbishopric was abolished in 1767 by a decree from Sultan Mustafa III. With that decree, the Slavs that were under the Archbishopric of Ohrid were under the Patriarchate of Constantinople following the abolishment. So not only were the Macedonian Slavs under Turkish rule, but now they had to deal with the removal of Slavic and the placement of Greek in their churches, which began a Hellenization of Slavs. As you can see, the Macedonian Slavs were placed under a very, very difficult situation. Ottoman control, Hellenization, living in the heart of the Balkan Peninsula, which everyone wanted from themselves. It was a nightmare. Thankfully, the fight for freedom finally came in the 19th century with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of nationalism. How did Macedonian Slavs fight for their liberation, what measures they took, and what their national revival looked like will be questions for episode 3. We will also talk about the start of the Macedonian nation building and why it took longer for the Macedonian national identity to form. In the meantime, thank you for watching and for your patience. PNM signing out.